Well, thanks very much, Candy. And thanks very much for the invite to the network today. There's been some fascinating talks, and it's really good to be here, so thank you. My name is William Housley. I'm here with my colleagues, actually my boss, Professor Malcolm Williams, Director of the Cardiff School of Social Sciences, and my colleague Adam Edwards. What we want to do today is actually discuss and reflect some of the methodological issues and indeed some of the ethical issues. I think some of the ethical issues referred to really extremely important. It's really good to hear those really articulately kind of discussed in the previous talk. But we want to do that through our engagement with something called Cosmos, which is the Cardiff Online Social Media Observatory, which is a very close collaboration between social scientists and computer scientists in Cardiff University. And this includes not just myself, Malcolm Williams and Adam Edwards, but also Professor O'Marana, Professor Nick Avis, Dr. Matthew Williams, and Dr. Pete Burnup, and Dr. Luke Sloan. Okay. The whole idea of Cosmos itself was couched within, I'm sure people are familiar with this, the coming crisis of empirical sociology, whereby which notions of transactional data, often privately owned by large-scale multinationals and so on, has meant that some, and a lot of social scientists, there's been some anxiety about the extent to which social science, and indeed publicly funded social science, is able to compete with the marshalling of large transactional, private, corporate data sets. On the other hand, with the kind of development and the growth of Web 2, this may also be an opportunity, an unseen opportunity through which we can perhaps not get access to transactional data as such, but certainly use Web 2 as an opportunity through which to perhaps develop new methods, new tools in a way which perhaps at least augments or perhaps manages the so-called empirical crisis. Social media, therefore, perhaps an interactive web, providing potential for systematic data mining, the analysis of naturally occurring data, thereby rendering new populations visible and thinkable. An extremely exciting opportunity, if indeed that is the case. So as a consequence, Cosmos is involved primarily with thinking about method, thinking about the ethics, the legal aspects of data harvesting and analysis of kind of data and social media data, but also fundamentally oriented towards the development of a range or a suite of digital social science tools. Okay. So the overall aim being to evaluate technical, methodological and ethical challenges presented by social media data in the context of the social sciences. As a means of actually pursuing this objective, and in a way this is kind of important in terms of the methodological reflections that we're going to kind of discuss very shortly, is a number of kind of case studies. The first and perhaps the most foremost case study at this stage of the Cardiff Online Social Media Observatory being the development of a set of tools that are able to examine social cohesion and tension within different types of community, where we might want to be able to analyse social media data for the purposes of monitoring social cohesion, social tension before, during and after major events. For example, urban riots, we've heard about that earlier, industrial action, political protests, elections, major sporting events and so on. This is also characterised by a number of demonstrator objectives. Of course, this involves working very closely with our computer science colleagues, and there's all sorts of interesting literature about collaboration between different kind of groups, bodies of expertise and how that actually operates. It's been very fascinating for us in terms of not just being, as it were, a recipient of various types of user requirements, but actually being actively involved with the actual building of an observatory, form a platform through which we can begin to operationalise a range of digital social science tools. And that, interestingly enough, has also perhaps made very clear to us the importance of methodology and thinking about methodology within the context of the long tradition that we have in the social sciences, because methodological issues, clearly when you're working within this type of context, which I'm sure many other people here today are, has a direct effect on the actual requirements, the actual shaping of the type of engineering, the type of platform and the type of tools that one is developing. So it's in this context that rather than thinking about methodological issues as some kind of abstract set of ideas, they're absolutely integral to the way in which we think about design, implementation and so on. Okay. before I pass over to my colleagues, I want to introduce kind of two basic kind of heuristic frames which we've developed to begin thinking about how method and methodological issues, methodological debates inform and shape not only the Cardiff Online Social Media Observatory, but also engaging with the wider community as we approach and begin to think about the way in which Web 2, social media analytics and so on can perhaps revolutionise or indeed deal with the so-called empirical deficit, the so-called empirical crisis that some people have perceived to be a symptom of contemporary social science due to the developments that I outlined previously. This first heuristic is a way of thinking about, for example, social media analytics in terms of intensive and extensive research strategies, but also in terms of what we might call locomotive research design as opposed to punctiform research design. Quite fancy kind of terms. Perhaps another way of thinking about that is kind of process and structure. But the fact that there's a potential for social media analytics to provide a way of rendering populations visible in terms of naturally occurring mediated data, the pulse of the world, if you like, and also in terms of real and useful time. So rather than taking, as it were, a punctiform snapshot of kind of social structure, as it were, through cross-sectional qualitative interviewing or indeed surveys, one is able perhaps to begin to think about, does social media afford a way of thinking about populations and social organisation on the move as it changes in real time and so on. The second heuristic that we're going to talk about, or we want to explore, involves four considerations. The first, and these considerations are born of our involvement with the Cardiff Online Social Media Observatory as we develop and build it. Firstly, our new social media analytic methods and associated computational digital methods a surrogate for conventional terrestrial social research? Secondly, are they an augmentation of conventional terrestrial social research? Or thirdly, does this represent a radical reorientation of social research methods? And then fourthly, but in no way finally, the ethical implications. I'm now going to pass over to my colleagues, and then if we have time, we might also try and link this back to the way in which methodology and data also relates to questions of ethics. Malcolm.
I feel a bit of an imposter here. That I'm pretty much a traditional methods person, and I was certainly an imposter to see my name there as part of Cosmos. I think these guys thought that as head of school, a day out in London would be good for me. So, so here I am. I say that by way of introduction because I think my role actually in Cosmos is perhaps to be a critical friend, and both critical and friend, or perhaps very often just a grumpy uncle. But I'll just say something about my own background first, and I'm going to say just a few things, fairly kind of, not high level, not like highfalutin, but kind of a fairly higher level issues that I think that new social media opens up for us, both positive and negative. But first, a little bit about the kind of stuff I've done in the past to show just how traditional I am. Is that my theoretical interests are around probability theory, sampling rare and elusive populations. My empirical work has mostly been using longitudinally linked census data to look at things like migration, household change, living alone, those kinds of things, and also to measure rare and elusive populations. So perhaps trying to do things that are a little bit different, but within those traditional methods. So I come to this thinking, those headings I quite liked that Will and Adam showed to me about are these surrogates, augmentation, reorientation, and I kind of tried to think about those. And I suppose let's start with what I think social research is about. You may disagree with me, but I think it's about three kinds of things. I think it's about explanation, I think it's about description, and I think it's about understanding. And at different moments in our social research, we're doing each of those. But, you know, I'm a follower of Weber, that I believe that, that we need to move to causes, perhaps through meanings to causes. You know, the two things are terribly important. To what extent, then, can new social media help us with that? The first thing, my starting point, then, is that I think that it's doing something it's doing something quite different to what we've done before. New data sources and new data. It's different. We've not done it before, and yet many of the methodological issues are similar, and so are some of the opportunities similar to what we've had in the past. But it's mostly not a surrogate. First of all, the sheer volume of data is just music to my ears, because we just don't get those kinds of... I mean, the biggest samples I've ever dealt with is subsets of census data of 100,000 cases, which is tiny compared to some of these samples. Secondly, it can capture some elements of process not normally available in cross-sectional research, certainly, but also not really available in longitudinal methods over relatively long periods. What we call true longitudinal data is, as William said, it's punctiform in that we gather data at particular points, and we kind of have to almost infer the changes between that. We can make those interjections at almost any point, so that's an advantage. Can we find the kinds of identifiers, the things like IP addresses, that we can sample over time to create those kinds of longitudinal data? Second issue is that of meaning. Now, I think that there's been a lot of talk this morning about access to meaning, and I think this can be ambiguous. Clearly, there are issues of what people mean, but we can probably, I think there's the possibilities here of doing a kind of a second-order ethnography, providing we can get a sample, and I'll say more about this in a second, a sample of people who we're finding using various kinds of new social media, Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and doing more traditional work with them as well. So the word that comes to my mind then, I'll say a little more about this in just 1 second, is normalization, and normalization of either the Twitter sample or the, depending which way around you're doing this, or the more traditional one. However, the biggest disadvantage for me, and I cannot ever see us being able to do these kinds of things, it cannot give me good demographic projections. It can provide socioeconomic data on household formation, on dissolution, on migration, on housing, employment, education, ethnicity, all of those kinds of things, the bread and butter of social research. It cannot do those yet. It probably won't be able to with the kinds of media we see at the moment, but maybe we can imagine new kinds of media where it can. Samples, you know, it's a home truth, I'm afraid. Samples are at present skewed by age, location, class, because globally, new social media users are a relatively narrow demographic group. Though we can normalise those variables if we can use methods of imputation, again, through a decent knowledge of absent groups. Look, I can give you a better example of how we've done this with more traditional data. We had a data set of census data where we wanted to look at ethnicity. Now, in the census, there is at least, in the ethnicity question, one can write in one's ethnic group if it's not in the list. And some of these are then subsequently analysed. But, of course, as you can imagine, the distribution of the responses is going to be skewed towards those people who are more self-aware, more educated, and so on and so forth. What you can do then is to impute, normalise those data in the census by taking samples from other surveys where the questions have included that ethnic group as a tick box category. So you can then normalise the census data, giving you that nice large sample. I think there are possibilities for that kind of imputation doing precisely the same kind of thing with new social media data and using traditional samples as well. One thing that was mentioned this morning was the problem of self-selection in web profiles, particularly, say, on Facebook. Now, I think this is logically the same as the issue of what we call face sheet data in surveys, where you ask people about their, if these are face-to-face interviews, the issue of sex is not a particular problem, though I have come across occasions where it might be. But things like age, social class, all of those kinds of things, we have to take the answers as pretty much the truth. Well, it's logically the same kind of issue, I think, with profiles that people put up. And again, over large samples, you can look at the kinds of distributions that you're getting to see whether it makes sense with the demographic that you have. Turning the other way around, one of the biggest problems that we have in survey research at the moment, and something that Savage and Burrows mentioned in their paper, is that we have a huge problem of non-response. And the non-responding groups are those people under 25 years, males, living in public housing, living in inner cities. Now, to some extent, the demographic group that we can access through new social media is precisely the demographic group that is absent in the surveys. So there are huge opportunities there for us to make good our knowledge through traditional methods, through knowledge through new methods. We can use new social media to develop better questions, I think, because of although dirty data, it's naturally occurring data. Though, again, there are going to be kind of issues about how you can extract those kinds of questions from that naturally occurring data when, as Mike pointed out this morning, you have to look for the nuance in in what's said in the tweet. Is it a belief? Is it an attitude? If the tweet says, yes, everything's fine. Now, is that a belief that everything is fine, or yes, that's fine? Yeah? What do we mean by, what's meant there? So, possibilities there. Then, a reorientation. I think at the higher level, it changes social research. It changes it because it renders questions about whether research is nomothetic or ideographic, quant qual, somewhat irrelevant. In other words, I think if the paradigm wars were not already over, this could well kill them off. But then there are implications for statistics. There are implications for the old forms of social research. Most statistical reasoning is based on frequency theories of probability, which begins from the assumption of linear relationships from within a probability sample. We can't do that anymore with new social media. Problem is knowing the bounds of the population, what the sampling unit will be in relation to this. So it does then open up the possibilities of other approaches which are kind of being developed along, again, in that kind of in the traditional camp, those such as case-based cluster analysis or large-N qualitative comparative analysis. Those are the possibilities of those methods are I think, not yet thought through. I thought this morning, for those of you who know of the method, that seemed to me to be a possibility for sampling here, is something called respondent-driven sampling, which follows on from the idea of the network and the snowball, but looks for saturation within those networks. But it's what the new social media won't do is obviate a problem that I wrestle with constantly, is the problem in Britain in particular of the quantitative analytic deficit. We have a huge deficit of quantitatively competent researchers, but it might help us to sell a more analytic approach that uses these kind of very large data sets in a sexier kind of way to young people who are entering social research for the first time. So I'm quite excited about that, about the development possibly of a new sub-discipline of computational social science. The last thing I want to say something about, though, is ethics. And I was fascinated by the last talk about the kinds of ethical issues that we as researchers are going to face, particularly in how we respond to criticisms about sampling and access. But there's one thing that worries me possibly more than any of these things, and I'm not sure what the answer to this is. At the moment, the possibilities for linking traditional social data sets with genetic information is becoming a reality. And there's a whole bunch of ethical issues around that are going on at the moment. But it's methodologically now possible to do that. Now, what worries me is if you can link web profiles to some form of postcode data, then you get to link a hell of a lot of stuff together. Who owns those data? What do we do with them? Where do we go with that kind of thing? It does open up the possibility of the panopticon society truly then. That's my big worry. And on that pessimistic note, I will stop and hand over to Adam.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm conscious of the time. Don't want to eat too much into the workshops where we get the opportunity to have some dialogue around this. I just want to give a little case study, a social problem, which both explains what excites me about social media, what I think are its potentials, but also some of its challenges, including some of the ethical issues which Malcolm has just begun to touch upon. I would say I'm a relative newcomer to this area, unlike other colleagues we've heard from today, hence the antediluvian, pen and ink notes to talk from. But I came at this through, particularly from my background, with an interest in sociology of deviance, social control, policing, which is my main sort of teaching and research background hitherto. And a particular interest in the idea of official constructions of civil unrest, okay, the dependence, if you like, on the one hand, qualitatively on the subjective perceptions of key officers, police officers, patrol officers, yeah, and an attempt, on the other hand, to try and to more systematise that, but again using what our colleagues in computer science and informatics like to call curated data. I love that term. But it's the sort of data that from this country you would get from the UK Office of National Statistics, census data, recorded crime data, general household survey data, and so on and so forth. A problem which can be thought of in terms of the indication of tension then. This comes back to the point which William was making earlier about one of our demonstrator projects for what the new social media can and can't do. And so a brief story. The riot in Bradford in 2001 was somewhat of a turning point, I think, in thinking about civil unrest and the official construction of that. Police forces had been using notions of tension indication for 20 years before that, really following the riots in the early 1980s and the very famous report by Lord Scarman, the riots not far from here in Brixton, Handsworth in Birmingham, and in other major English cities. And the idea was to try and anticipate then these sorts of things happening again by such things as patrol police officers talking to residents and tenants associations, looking at sort of graffiti on the wall, the strange disappearance of milk bottles being stored up for Molotov cocktails and such like, Well, we're talking about a kind of rudimentary, in one sense, quite ethnographic, yes? Form of research. It's interesting to think about police constables as the sort of latter-day Walter Benjamins, the sort of flaneurs of urban disorder, collecting that kind of data. And that was pretty much the sort of qualitative approach, to come back to the, the sort of intensive but locomotive, getting a sense of how disorder was boiling up in a particular neighbourhood. But of course, always through the eyes of the particular police officer. Their existing concepts, their way of constructing their neighbourhood through police occupational subcultural concepts. And so we come to Bradford in 2001. And at that time, the tension, as perceived by the police, was about street drugs markets, yeah, and the interpersonal violence surrounding those. And what was being completely missed, not recorded, not sent back to headquarters, not picked up by other agencies, was the mobilisation of the far right, the British National Party, on the streets in those neighbourhoods. Yeah? So the understanding, the anticipation of that major unrest was completely lost. Subsequently, an attempt was made to try and, again, capture that more systematically, less dependent upon the subjective constructions of police patrol officers, through something which was developed by the Association of Chief Police Officers and the Giordano Institute for Crime Science, called the Vulnerable Localities Index. Now, this would be an indication, an instance of what Will referred to earlier as a punctiform, extensive research strategy. Okay, so using census, using recorded crime data, using indices of multiple deprivation levels of unemployment, income in households, and so on, to try and identify hotspots and trends and patterns. Okay. But the problem then with that sort of data is that it's retrospective and it doesn't capture the unfolding processes in time. For me, what I find really fascinating, stimulating, exciting about the new social media is that it offers us the prospect of transcending this dependence upon ethnographic immersion in a particular focus, which can give you process but suffers to capture, changes at the level of population on the one hand, and these sorts of extensive punctiform research strategies dependent upon secondary analysis of large curated data sets, which may capture populations but not how they're evolving, or relatively rather crudely. The key defining feature for me then of social media like Twitter then is that it is naturally occurring data from large populations. The challenge that we have is to connect that then to offline communities, if you like. And I defer to the expertise of our colleagues in the Cardiff collaboration in computer science and informatics, but I understand it is possible to derive location data from a lot of tweets. And that's quite an interesting and kind of challenging prospect. Okay, so how might then, just to finish off my little story, how might social media augment, if it is not, it cannot act as a surrogate for curated data sets or for the sort of ethnographic, subjective constructions of problems, such as patrolling police officers. Nonetheless, how might it augment that? One instance is what we've called as a form of signature science, if I can indicate this. So what we mean by a signature then is this is a corpus of tweets which we harvested in April last month, on the same day that there was, some of you certainly here in London may be more than aware of this, a hostage incident on the Tottenham Court Road related to a dispute at a benefits office. A very kind of aggrieved person who can thoroughly sympathise with the often humiliating experience which benefit claimants in this country have to go through. I got so aggravated that he'd taken one of the benefits clerks hostage. And this was shows you here the change in traffic, activity around this of people in the vicinity very shortly after this incident occurred. How do we derive that? Which comes back to some of our methodological questions. We, from the 1.25 million tweets that we'd so happened to have harvested that day in Cardiff, we use the hashtags. So this is the kind of key then device then for extracting more event-specific, perhaps even location-specific data around that, using the hashtags TCR, Tottenham Court Road, mayhem, and hostage. And it produced that. Now, of course, that can in no way be seen to be representative of all the people who are in the locality or even all the people who are talking about that. But what's interesting is the activity. So this might present a sort of signature. Yeah? Now, if we can begin to develop a better corpus of hashtags, yeah, along the lines which Malcolm was talking about, along our kind of knowledge of particular social problems like civil unrest, which is quite accumulated social scientific knowledge in this country. Yeah? We might be able to render visible then populations, understandings of these problems which were hitherto blocked out by the dependence upon official constructions of the problem. Yeah? So, had back in 2001, as a long time ago now in terms of new technologies and data that was available, had this kind of data been available, might it have been the fact that a lot of the Asian population in Bradford, in the northern cities, would have been tweeting about the mobilisation of the BNP on the streets there. Yeah? We might have been able to capture that through a set of hashtags. That might have then provided a signature that something else was going on other than or in competition with the police or public constructions of the problem. So these are the sort of way in which we might augment more conventional terrestrial forms of social research methods, such as the data I've been talking about. Finally then, we might reorientate analysis. There's a lot we could talk about here, but again, just to stick with a particular example, because this helps us to reframe the problem. Okay? There are people who are naturally occurring data uploading, alerting us to the fact that there are major problems of sort of racist harassment and violence on the streets in a particular locality, which we've been able to extract by using sampling techniques like hashtags. That helps us to reframe and contest official constructions of the problem. No, it's about the street drugs trade. Yeah? So we can contest that. I'll finish off because that leads us to a concept we've been using to think more broadly about the question of ethics. I've really found the discussion very stimulating today. But it wants us to broaden this discussion of different notions of power and their relationship to the new social media. And of course, this could be used for panoptic purposes. Of course it could. Of course it could. It would be fanciful to think it isn't already, quite frankly, yes? But as a public social science, yeah, using this sort of data, this provides a form of what the criminologist Thomas Mathiasson called synoptic power. Yeah, the many viewing the few. Okay? That this provides naturally occurring alternative data which can help reframe, reorient forms of analysis. But with that comes certain ethical questions. And I'll hand over to Will again.
Okay, I think we'll conclude, but just to take that point, if we can just go back. And as Adam says, clearly, you know, the affordances and developments in relation to what we might call the potential for panoptic surveillance, panoptic power and so on, clearly something that we have to think about. But again, seeing it the other way around, maybe in terms of synoptic surveillance or synoptic power. I think one of the things that we're thinking about, again, in terms of how it informs our methodological discussions and so on, is how that issue, which is ethical, but also to do with the democratization of data, or the non-democratization and analysis of data, you know, informs the way we think about how we develop our tools, how we think about how this new form of analysis in relation to whether it's augmentation, perhaps surrogacy, perhaps augmentation, or indeed reorientation, but nevertheless, how these new forms of social analysis and their associated tools begin to inform and fit into the emerging contours of what we might call digital society, digital cultures and so on, and how that kind of relates perhaps to matters that relate to the public good and not just private gain. There are certainly kind of well-established debates and trends within computer science, you know, that relate to collaboration, open source, software and so on. But I think in terms of a very fruitful engagement with social science, I think we can inform that debate as well in terms of matters that relate to kind of not just the analysis of new social media, but actually how that also informs, you know, the contours of new digital society, democracy, and associated forms of power, and so on. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.